When you open up a map app on your phone to figure out how to get across town, there is this very deep, sort of unspoken assumption built into that tiny glowing screen.
Yeah, absolutely.
The assumption is that you are looking at this single, universally agreeable reality. Like you see the streets, the borders, the topography, and the expectation is that this representation is absolute.
Right. It implies a singular, objective vantage point,
Exactly.
a view from nowhere, essentially.
Yeah.
Just looking down on everything and declaring, this is exactly how things are.
Right. And it's incredibly comforting to believe that we naturally want our reality to be singular.
Of course we do. It's easier.
Yeah, we want everything categorized neatly, without any messy overlap or glaring contradictions. But today, we are going to tear up that map.
We really are.
Because when you start looking at the actual frameworks that govern human experience, and we were talking about everything from the deep architecture of human culture to the mathematics of biological growth.
And even the physics of artificial intelligence.
Yes. When you look at all that single flat map starts to look not just inadequate, but functionally broken.
Yeah, it really does.
The reality you and I actually live in is this epistemic landscape bursting at the seams with overlapping, sometimes completely contradictory realities.
It is the absolute definition of an ontological collision.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, we are constantly forced to ask how different, inherently contradictory worlds of knowledge can possibly coexist without one simply overriding or destroying the other.
Well, welcome to the deep dive. Today we have an absolute monster of a mission ahead of us. We are taking you on what we're calling a pluriversal research synthesis.
It's a massive topic.
It is. We have synthesized an incredibly diverse, massive stack of sources for you today. We are going to explore the mathematics of biological scaling, algorithms for GPS trajectory mapping, the philosophy of decolonial computing, and even the theoretical physics of the human brain.
Which sounds disconnected, but it's not.
Right. Our goal is to find the invisible architecture that holds all of this together. We are looking for the structural topologies, those deep, overarching patterns that will help you grasp the overwhelming complexity of our universe without drowning in information overload.
Or, to use the terminology from our sources, our pluriverse.
Yes, the pluriverse. And to navigate this, we are going to use a specific cognitive filter. We're calling it a paraconsistent lens.
I love that term.
Yeah, basically, instead of looking at contradictions in nature or data as like errors that need to be erased, we're going to view them as opportunities.
Right, using them to find the hidden boundaries of different systems.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this. What exactly is the difference between a universe and a pluriverse?
Well, the shift is a profound conceptual leap. Let's start with classical epistemology, which, often champions pluralism.
Okay, pluralism.
Pluralism assumes there is one single static reality out there. Imagine a single apple sitting on a table in the center of a room.
Just a normal apple.
Right. Pluralism says we are all standing in different corners of the room, looking at the same apple. We have different perspectives, sure, but the fundamental reality of the universe is singular.
So if I'm looking at the apple from one side, I see a bruise, and you see a shiny red surface.
Exactly.
We might argue about what the apple looks like, but we both agree on the fundamental physical properties of the apple and the table it sits on.
That's the classical pluralist view. But the general theory of pluriversal knowledge, or GTPK, which runs through all our sources, argues that this framework is a vast oversimplification.
Oh, wow, okay.
Yeah. Pluriversality begins with the premise that reality is actually composed of multiple, partially overlapping worlds.
Overlapping worlds.
Right. And each of these worlds is sustained by entirely distinct ontological commitments, relational practices, and material engagements.
Wait, I need to stop you there because distinct ontological commitments is a phrase that sounds great in a university lecture hall but is really hard to visualize. What does that actually mean for the people living in those worlds?
Think of it as the foundational rules of existence for a given system. And ontology is the study of what is real.
Okay.
In a pluriverse, these worlds are not mere interpretations of a single central apple. They are completely different modes of existence.
I see.
One world might be governed by the strict, reproducible laws of a mathematical simulation. Another might be governed by a complex social kinship network where reality is defined by relationships, not just physics.
Right.
Each world is coherent and autonomous within itself. They are essentially running on different foundational code bases.
Okay, so it's less like people looking at the same apple and more like a massive multiplayer online game
Yeah.
where players are somehow in the same lobby, but their avatars are running completely different physics engines.
That's a great way to think about it.
Like one player is playing a racing game, another is playing a farming simulator, and another is playing a space shooter, but they're in the same lobby.
That is a remarkably apt analogy, particularly the part about the game engines. But this brings us to a historical tension highlighted extensively in our sources on decolonial computing.
Okay, where does that come in?
Historically, the expansion of Western technological modernity operated on a universalist epistemology. It treated its own highly specific, localized game engine as the only objective representation of a static reality out there.
And when one system believes it is the sole arbiter of what is real, it tends to just, bulldoze everything else.
Precisely.
It assumes the players running the farming simulator are just playing the space shooter incorrectly.
The literature describes this structural dominance as the colonial matrix of power. When this monocentric approach asserts a supposedly neutral, universal position, it systematically delegitimizes and suppresses localized, oral, land-based, and relational knowledge systems.
It just wipes them out.
Yeah. Scholars like Walter Mignolo and Annabel Quijano referred to this systemic erasure of alternative ways of knowing and being as epistemicide.
Epistemicide, the literal death of knowledge systems. That is a heavy but vital concept.
It really is.
And we just want to make clear, as we discuss this, we are impartially reporting the viewpoints found in our sources regarding the history of computing and indigenous knowledge.
Absolutely. We are outlining the structural arguments the authors make.
Right. And the counter-movement to this is something called epistemic disobedience, right?
Yes. It is the deliberate refusal to be governed by that single monocentric classification system.
Mm.
Epistemic disobedience is about designing and validating systems according to alternative cosmologies.
Okay.
It heavily relies on recognizing what the sources call the locus of enunciation.
Oh, I love this concept. It basically dismantles the myth of the disembodied observer, that view from nowhere we talked about with the map app.
Exactly.
The locus of enunciation says that where you are speaking from your history, your culture, your geography, your funding sources inevitably shapes what you know. There is no neutral data.
Which fundamentally shifts the focus of the decolonial framework. It isn't just a philosophical critique of the past. It is a demand for an entirely different operational architecture moving forward.
Okay, so building new systems.
Right. It requires us to build digital and societal infrastructure that explicitly acknowledges every dataset and every algorithm has a locus of enunciation.
I'm tracking with you, but I have to play devil's advocate here because I know you, the listener, might be thinking the exact same thing.
Go for it.
If everyone is living in their own reality with their own distinct ontology, their own physics engine, doesn't that inevitably lead to total chaos?
That's the fear, yeah.
Doesn't that invite absolute relativism where nothing is objectively true and we can't ever agree on how to build a bridge that won't collapse or synthesize a vaccine that actually works?
It's a very valid question.
Because if the lobby has no shared rules, doesn't the game just crash?
That is the most common and perhaps the most important critique of pluriversality. And the general theory of pluriversal knowledge explicitly addresses this. It is not relativism.
Okay, how so?
The game doesn't crash because of a phenomenon called pluriversal coherence. This is an emergent property that allows multiple knowledge systems to coexist and collaborate without hierarchy, assimilation, or fragmentation.
Walk me through the mechanics of that. How do we achieve coherence without a universal standard?
What's fascinating here is that each system maintains rigorous internal validity. They simply validate differently according to their specific ontology.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Scientific knowledge validates through mathematical reproducibility, double-blind trials, and controlled physical modeling. That is incredibly rigorous.
Yeah, definitely.
Meanwhile, an indigenous knowledge system might validate its truth through strict relational continuity with the land, ancestry, and ecological practice observed over millennia. That is also incredibly rigorous.
Right, so they both have rules.
Exactly. Neither is universally superior in a vacuum. Validity is situated and accountable within each world. Coherence happens when these systems engage in structured interaction, finding functional overlaps without forcing one to adopt the validation methods of the other.
Okay, so it's about building an interface between the physics engines rather than forcing everyone to use the same one.
Precisely.
And the sources actually give us a concrete use case for what this looks like in the real world, the Mukurtu Hub and SSOM. And SSOSUM, for the record, stands for the Simple Standard for Sharing Ontological Mappings.
Mukurtu is a brilliant practical application of decolonial computing. It's a digital content management system built with and for indigenous communities to manage their cultural heritage.
Why do they need a separate system?
Well, look at standard Western archival systems. They're built on an ontology of universal open access, the idea that information intrinsically wants to be free. It belongs in the public domain, and anyone with an internet connection should be able to view anything.
But in many indigenous cultures, knowledge isn't universally open in that way. The ontology is different.
Right.
Access to specific stories, images, or ecological data is heavily contextual. It might depend on your gender, your age, your specific clan lineage, or even the time of year, like maybe a story that can only be told during the winter.
If you take that deeply contextual knowledge and force it into a standard universalist database, you are committing a form of epistemicide.
Because you break their rules.
Exactly. You strip away the cultural ontology that gives the knowledge its meaning, its safety, and its power. You turn a lived reality into flat data.
Wow.
Mukurtu operates on pluriversal principles to prevent this. It allows communities to share digital heritage while retaining strict, culturally defined access protocols built directly into the code.
And that's where SSOM comes in.
Yes, tools like SSOM allow for ontological mappings. They let the Mukurtu database communicate with the wider internet, finding those points of functional overlap, but they ensure the local context acts as an unbreakable boundary.
The knowledge interfaces with the wider digital world, but it is never subsumed by it. It maintains its locus of enunciation.
Exactly.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
But it leads me to a really deep structural question.
Okay.
If the pluriverse is made of all these overlapping autonomous realities, these different game engines running side by side, how do we find stability? If there is no single universal law governing everything, what keeps these individual systems from eventually dissolving into chaos?
To answer that, we have to look for what mathematicians and computer scientists call invariance.
Invariance.
Yes, an invariant is a structural topology. It is a specific property, a rule, or a mathematical truth that holds true and remains perfectly stable inside a specific system, regardless of the noise, mutation, or chaos happening around it.
And to understand the architecture of an invariant, we are going to pivot completely and dive straight into the logic of software verification.
It's a great pivot.
Because, strangely enough, the way a computer scientist debugs a piece of code provides the absolute perfect metaphor for how realities sustain themselves.
We need to examine loop invariants.
Okay, tell me about those.
When you write a software program, you rely heavily on loops. These are blocks of instructions that repeat over and over, continually changing the data with each iteration until a specific exit condition is finally met.
Right, like searching through a massive database.
Formal software verification, which traces its roots back to Floyd-Hoare logic, requires that we mathematically prove these loops will actually work as intended and eventually terminate.
Wait, back up. Floyd-Hoare logic and formal software verification, what does that actually look like for a coder sitting at a keyboard? Because usually when a program crashes, it's because it gets stuck in an infinite loop, right? It just spins forever, eating up memory.
That is exactly the danger. You need a conservation law for the software. And that is what a loop invariant provides.
How does it work?
It is described as an inductive logical predicate. In simpler terms, it is a mathematical statement of truth that you, the programmer, declare. This statement must hold true before the loop even starts, and it must hold true after every single iteration of the loop, no matter how chaotic the data mutations inside the loop become.
So it's an anchor.
It is the ultimate anchor. The literature outlines 3 necessary components for a valid loop invariant: initiation, consecution, and a variant.
Let's break those down. Initiation.
Initiation means the invariant must be demonstrably true at the very start before the loop executes its first pass.
It sets the baseline truth.
Okay.
Yes.
The second component is consecution. This means that if the invariant is true at the beginning of an iteration, the mathematical operations happening inside the loop's body guarantee it will still be true at the end of that iteration.
The truth is conserved through the chaos.
Right. And the variant, you mentioned that third. The variant is the mechanism that prevents the infinite loop.
What does that look like?
It is a discrete, measurable distance to the exit condition. It guarantees that the loop is actually making progress toward a goal and won't spin endlessly. Every iteration of the loop must decrease this variant until it hits 0, triggering the software to exit the loop and move on.
Okay, let's visualize this, because trying to hold initiation and consecution in your head without a spatial map is tough.
It is.
Imagine a 2D plane, an X and Y axis stretching out flat. Let's say this plane represents all the mutating data, the variables changing, the chaotic processing happening inside the body of the software loop.
Okay, I see it.
As the program runs, it's drawing wild, chaotic circles all over this 2D plane. But the loop invariant is the z-axis.
But like this, a z-axis inference.
Exactly. It's a vertical pillar of mathematical truth extending straight up from the chaos of the flat plane. No matter where the program wanders on that 2D XY plane of changing variables, if you look up the z-axis, that invariant pillar is solidly there, unchanging. It anchors the chaos to a specific intent.
And this spatial bind is precisely what allows developers to verify incredibly complex systems. By identifying the z-axis, the invariant, we don't have to track every single microscopic mutation on the 2D plane.
We don't have to trace a million wild circles.
Exactly. We just have to prove that the vertical pillar remains standing after each cycle.
Here's where it gets really profound. Invariants aren't just a trick for debugging code so an app doesn't crash. They are a profound way of understanding intent.
They really are.
As the sources note, the invariant gives you fundamental information about what a loop is actually trying to achieve. You literally cannot truly understand an algorithm without knowing its invariant.
If we apply our pair-consistent lens and bring this back to the pluriverse, the structural parallel is striking.
Yeah.
Just as you cannot understand an algorithm without its loop invariant, you cannot understand a culture, a biological system, or an indigenous knowledge framework without knowing its core ontological anchor, its own z-axis.
Yes, and we actually see this philosophy formalized in computer science with specific programming languages like Eiffel.
Right, Eiffel.
The Eiffel language uses something called axiomatic semantics. Instead of the loop invariant just being an idea the programmer holds in their head, it is explicitly written right into the syntax of the code.
The computer reads it.
Exactly. The programmer has to declare the invariant up front, and the system automatically verifies the program's correctness based on it. It's making the implicit intent explicitly auditable.
It creates a self-auditing boundary. But of course, software loops are human-made. They are synthetic systems where we get to define the rules and the bounds.
Right.
If pluriversality is a fundamental structural property of reality, we should expect to see natural systems generating their own invariants. We should see biology creating boundaries between order and chaos without human intervention.
Okay, so if software has these vertical pillars to keep loops from crashing, what keeps biological loops from crashing? Like, how does a living cell or a human brain not just dissolve into the chaotic environment around it?
To answer that, we have to move from computer science to theoretical neurobiology, specifically a framework called the free energy principle.
Oh boy. If you haven't encountered the free energy principle, or FEP, brace yourself. It is one of the most ambitious, encompassing, and frankly mind-bending theories in contemporary science.
It is huge.
It originates primarily from the work of Carl Friston, and it is essentially an attempt to explain the fundamental underlying imperative of all living, self-organizing systems.
The free energy principle starts with a highly specific view of the brain, and really any biological agent. It views the agent as a statistical machine.
A statistical machine.
Yes, it builds heavily on the Bayesian brain hypothesis. This hypothesis suggests that the brain performs continuous, unconscious statistical inference to guess the hidden causes of the sensory input it receives from the outside world.
Because if you think about it, the brain is locked inside a dark, silent skull. It doesn't actually see a tree or hear a bird.
Right, it's just in the dark.
It just receives a barrage of electrical spikes from the optic and auditory nerves. It has to constantly guess what external reality caused those electrical spikes.
Correct. The brain uses a Bayesian, pre-existing model of the world to make sense of the incoming data. The free energy principle takes this concept and expands it into a universal biological mandate.
Meaning what?
It posits that all self-organizing systems act to minimize their variational free energy. In this theoretical context, free energy isn't about usable physical energy. It is a mathematical proxy for surprisal, or sensory entropy.
Surprisal. It's exactly what it sounds like.
Yes, for a biological system, high surprisal is synonymous with danger and decay.
Give me an example.
Well, if a freshwater fish suddenly finds itself in saltwater, the incoming sensory data is highly surprising to its internal models. It represents a catastrophic breakdown of its environment, an existential threat.
Right, it's dying.
To survive, a system must restrict itself to a limited, highly predictable set of sensory encounters. It must maintain a state of low entropy.
But the universe is inherently chaotic. How does the system actually draw a boundary between itself and the surprising universe? How does it enforce its own internal logic?
It uses a statistical boundary called a Markov blanket.
Okay, let's unpack the Markov blanket because it is the linchpin of this entire biological pluriverse.
A Markov blanket is a boundary that statistically separates a system's internal states from its external environment. It is the mediator of all interactions,
So it's a wall.
a permeable one. The internal states, say the nucleus of a cell or the cognitive processes of a brain, can only interact with the external world through the blanket. The blanket itself consists of two parts:
What are they?
sensory states, which receive incoming data, and active states, which output actions into the world.
Let's ground this with a metaphor. Think of a Markov blanket like the bouncer and the manager at the door of a very exclusive underground nightclub.
I like where this is going.
The inside of the club, the dance floor, the bar, is the internal state of the organism. The wild street outside is the external environment. The club has a very specific vibe it wants to maintain. It wants a low-entropy, highly predictable environment. No surprises.
It is attempting to maintain a homeostatic equilibrium.
Right. So what happens if a huge group of rowdy people push their way in and suddenly the club gets too chaotic? Or what if the heating breaks and it gets freezing cold inside? The club is experiencing high surprisal.
The manager has two ways to minimize that surprise and get the free energy back down. Friston calls this process active inference.
The first option is perceptual inference.
Yes, the manager could just change their expectation. They could look around and say, you know what, freezing cold and incredibly rowdy is actually the exact vibe we are going for tonight.
Just accept the chaos.
In the brain, this means updating your internal generative model to match the surprising world. You change your perception. The brain adjusts its Bayesian prior to account for the new sensory data, thereby reducing the prediction error. The math balances out.
But the second option is usually better for survival. The manager tells the bouncer the active states of the Markov blanket to physically throw the rowdy people out into the street and crank up the thermostat.
Active inference in action.
You change the world to match your internal model. You act on the environment to bring your sensory input back into your expected low entropy range.
And by constantly performing this dance of active inference, updating models and acting on the world's biological systems maintain what physicists call non-equilibrium steady states, or NESS.
NES.
Yes, they actively resist thermodynamic decay. They fight off the universe's tendency toward entropy by constantly predicting and managing the boundaries of their Markov blanket. A cell wall is a literal, physical manifestation of a Markov blanket, managing the flow of ions to maintain a steady state against the chaotic soup outside.
It's brilliant. The bouncer and the thermostat keep the system from dissolving into the noise.
Now, if we connect this to the bigger picture, this is where the free energy principle becomes deeply philosophical. A world or a knowledge system survives precisely because its cultural or epistemic Markov blanket minimizes the surprisal of its participants.
Oh, wow.
A community's shared ontology, its language, its rituals, its scientific methods acts as a massive shared generative model that predicts and manages social and environmental interactions.
Oh, I see where this is going. So pluriversal coherence, that emergent property we talked about earlier where Mukurtu can talk to the wider internet without losing its indigenous context. That coherence happens when two systems with entirely different Markov blankets interact without one tearing the other's blanket apart.
That is the exact mechanism. They exchange signals across their sensory and active states, but they do not force the internal states of one to collapse into the generative model of the other.
They respect the boundary.
They remain statistically sealed but communicative. We actually see a microversion of this every day in human emotion recognition, which the sources touch upon.
Like when you're talking to a friend.
When you interact with a friend, your brain formulates ideas about their internal emotional state. You build an internal generative model of their internal states.
We're constantly trying to guess the hidden causes of their behavior. Like, are they mad at me or just hungry?
Exactly. We do this to predict their behavior, which in turn minimizes our own social surprisal. We are constantly navigating a landscape of overlapping autonomous Markov blankets.
So systems absolutely must maintain these boundaries, these invariants to survive. But here's the next piece. The puzzle systems don't just exist, they grow.
Right.
A cell divides, an organism gets larger, a city expands. But as you grow within those boundaries, the physics of your existence fundamentally changes.
Which brings us to the mathematical topologies of biology and the fascinating unresolved tension between continuous optimization and discrete scaling.
This is where we look at something called Kleiber's law. In biology, there is this incredibly famous observation that an organism's basal metabolic rate scales with its overall body mass.
Larger animals burn more total energy, obviously.
Right. But it doesn't scale linearly. If an animal is twice as big, it doesn't just need twice as much food, it scales to the 34 power. This is known as allometric scaling.
And the robustness of this 34 scaling exponent is staggering to biologists. It spans over 25 orders of magnitude in mass.
That's insane.
It applies to the tiniest individual respiratory complexes inside a cell, all the way up to the largest blue whales in the ocean. It appears to be a fundamental, universal invariant of biological life.
But why 34? What is the physical mechanism causing that specific number?
That was the mystery for a long time.
For a long time, scientists assumed the exponent should be 23. And the logic made sense. It was based on simple surface area to volume ratios.
Exactly.
As you scale up a 3D object, its internal volume increases much faster than its surface area. Since animals lose heat through their skin, their surface area, their metabolic rate should theoretically scale to the 23 power to match heat dissipation. But the empirical data clearly and stubbornly showed 34.
This mathematical anomaly was elegantly addressed in the late 1990s by the WBE model, named after the researchers West, Brown, and Enquist.
What did they propose?
They proposed that the 34 scaling exponent doesn't come from heat loss at the skin. It arises from the internal physical constraints of resource distribution networks, specifically the cardiovascular system in animals, or the branching vascular tubes in plants.
They modeled the plumbing of life.
Yes, they modeled life as a continuous, optimized fractal network. They argued that over millions of years, natural selection optimized these branching networks to distribute blood and nutrients to all the cells in the body with the minimum possible energy dissipation.
Okay, that makes sense.
When you mathematically model a space-filling, continuous fractal branching network where the tubes keep splitting into smaller and smaller capillaries, the 34 exponent emerges naturally from the geometry. It was hailed as a massive breakthrough, a beautiful piece of universalist physics applied perfectly to biology.
But remember our paraconsistent lens. We are looking for contradictions as opportunities.
Right.
And where there is a beautiful, perfectly smooth, universal, continuous theory, there is almost always a messy, discrete reality waiting to contradict it.
The contradiction with the WBE continuous model is subtle but absolutely critical. As later researchers like Savage and others pointed out, the WBE model only perfectly predicts that 34 exponent in the theoretical limit of an infinitely large organism.
Wait, let me stop you. What do you mean, an infinitely large organism?
The math behind the fractal network assumes that the branching can continue infinitely, getting infinitely smaller, perfectly filling the space. But real animals have a finite size.
Right. They have limits.
A capillary can only get so small before a single red blood cell can't fit through it. The fractal hits a physical wall. And when researchers look closely at the data for finite-sized organisms, which is to say, all actual living things, they found that they deviate from this pure continuous power law.
The line gets wobbly.
The smaller the animal, the more it deviates from the 34 line.
The reality of having a boundary breaks the universal math. Enter the Fibonacci discrete scaling model.
This is a fascinating alternative.
This is a newly proposed framework in our sources that says, hold on, maybe life isn't a perfectly smooth, continuous fractal limit. Maybe biological scaling is the cumulative result of successive discrete developmental stages.
The discrete model observes that biological systems often grow in geometric patterns that are strongly correlated with the Fibonacci sequence and the golden ratio. We see this everywhere in nature.
Like where?
It dictates phyllotaxis, the spiral arrangement of leaves on a plant stem, and it governs the discrete stages of cellular division. This new mathematical model suggests that scaling isn't a continuous limit that organisms are trying to reach, but rather a recursive hierarchy governed by discrete Fibonacci dynamics.
So what does this all mean? Why does it matter if we use continuous fractals or discrete Fibonacci steps to measure a mouse's heartbeat?
It matters deeply because it perfectly represents the tension between the universal and the pluriversal at a foundational mathematical level. The continuous WBE model assumes an infinite boundaryless optimization.
It's the view from nowhere again.
Exactly. It's a universalist view from nowhere. It smooths over the reality of the organism to find an elegant equation. The discrete Fibonacci model, however, fundamentally respects the finite-sized boundaries of actual living things.
It sees the edges.
It acknowledges that an organism is situated, bounded, and grows in distinct developmental stages. And most importantly, empirically, when this discrete framework is applied to the measured metabolic rates of various mammalian species, it provides a higher quantitative agreement with the real-world data than the infinite limit model.
It actually captures the deviations. It says the anomalies aren't measurement errors, they are structural truths about finite existence. The boundary matters, the discrete steps matter.
They absolutely do.
And this tension between perfect, smooth, universal power laws and the messy, bounded, finite reality, it doesn't just exist in biological tissue. It scales up. It dictates human language, the sizes of our cities, and even how artificial intelligence generates text.
Which transitions us seamlessly into the mathematics of diversity, and specifically the Zipf-Mandelbrot law.
Okay, if biology uses discrete steps because living things have finite physical boundaries, what happens when humans create something invisible, like language? Does our vocabulary hit that same mathematical wall?
It absolutely does, and the discovery of this is one of the most fascinating stories in linguistics. It begins with George Zipf, a linguist working in the early 20th century.
What did he find?
He observed an empirical pattern in human language that is so consistent it feels almost eerie. The frequency of a word is inversely proportional to its rank in the frequency table.
Let's break that down, meaning the most common word in the English language, which is the, occurs roughly twice as often as the second most common word, of,
Exactly.
and the occurs exactly 3 times as often as the third most common word, and so on down the list. If you plot this word frequency on a log-log graph, you get a perfectly straight descending line, a pure power law.
The consistency across different languages and even ancient texts is remarkable. Zipf attributed this mathematical phenomenon to what he called the principle of least effort.
Principle of least effort.
He theorized that language evolves under a constant push and pull evolutionary pressure between two opposing forces. First, the speaker wants to be as efficient as possible. They want to expend minimal effort, ideally using just 1 or 2 incredibly broad words to mean everything. That is speaker efficiency.
But the hearer wants the exact opposite. They want maximum specificity. They want a unique, distinct word for every single granular concept so there is zero ambiguity to decipher. Hearer efficiency.
The power law, that straight descending line on the graph, is the perfect mathematical compromise between those two evolutionary pressures. You get a few highly dominant broad words at the top and a massive long tail of rare, highly specific words at the bottom.
But we just learned that pure, smooth, continuous lines usually fail when they hit the real world. Just like the biological scaling, pure Zipf's law assumes a kind of infinite continuity that doesn't quite match reality when you look closely at the edges.
Exactly. And this is where Benoit Mandelbrot enters the picture. Mandelbrot, who later became famous as the father of fractal geometry, noticed a flaw in Zipf's pure power law.
What was the flaw?
When he looked at the most highly ranked, most frequent words, the very top of the curve, the empirical data deviated from the straight line. The curve flattened out. To account for this finite reality, Mandelbrot generalized the mathematics. He introduced the Zipf-Mandelbrot law.
I know reading math equations on an audio show is usually a terrible idea, but bear with me because the parameters in this equation are the secret sauce of the pluriverse.
They really are.
The equation is f of r equals c divided by r plus q to the power of s. Let's look at the parameters. R is just the rank of the word. S is the exponent controlling the decay of the curve. But q, the q parameter, is the star of the show.
Q is mathematically defined as the vital offset parameter. It accounts for finite vocabulary constraints and the limits of the communication channel. It is the mathematical variable that physically flattens the top of the curve for those highly frequent elements.
Wait. If q is an offset for finite limits, what is q conceptually? If we look at this through our pair-consistent lens, what does q represent in the real world?
This is where the synthesis becomes incredibly powerful. The Q parameter is the mathematical embodiment of a locus of enunciation.
Wow. Let's take that a step further. You're saying a letter in a math equation represents human culture. How does that actually compute?
Think about what the locus of enunciation means. It is the specific, localized, historical, and environmental constraints that shape what can be known or said. The Q parameter represents the local constraints, the specific boundary conditions, the finite environmental reality of a particular data set. It's the mathematical adjustment for the fact that a system, whether a language, a forest, or a city, is not infinite. It has a specific context.
And the sources show that we see this Q parameter everywhere. It's not just words in a book.
Not at all.
In ecology, the Zipf-Mandelbrot law perfectly models species abundance. You go into a specific forest and you find a few incredibly dominant species of trees and a long tail of very rare ones. The Q parameter shifts dynamically depending on the specific environmental heterogeneity of that exact forest.
It models urban demographics too, the rank and size of city populations in a country. It accommodates the specific economic and geographic concentrations of a region.
It is so robust that it is being used right now at the cutting edge of artificial intelligence to distinguish AI-generated text from human-written text.
Which is a huge application.
Let's expand on that AI detection use case because it's fascinating. Large language models, AI systems, are fundamentally trained to optimize predictability. They want to guess the next most logical word.
Exactly.
Because of this, they often produce token frequency distributions that are subtly anomalous compared to messy human writing. By analyzing a block of text and mathematically extracting the Cuban's parameters, researchers can detect the synthetic origin of the text.
The AI's locus of enunciation, its massive generalized training data, is computationally distinct from a human's bounded, localized vocabulary.
But let me push back on this because I think we're hitting a philosophical wall here.
All right, hit me.
If everything from the words I'm speaking to you right now, to the trees in the Amazon rainforest, to the population of Chicago, to the output of ChatGPT, if all of them follow this exact same Zipf-Mandelbrot equation, aren't we just back to a universal truth?
That's a very perceptive challenge.
Doesn't the fact that this math applies to everything violate the whole idea of the pluriverse having different realities?
It cuts to the core of the synthesis, yes. But the answer is no, because the Zipf-Mandelbrot law is what we define as a computational invariant.
A computational invariant.
It is a structural mechanism that organizes and maximizes diversity within boundaries. It does not dictate what the words are, or what the species of trees are, or what the cities are. It only dictates how a finite bounded system must organize its internal diversity to remain coherent and survive.
Oh, I see. It's the architecture of pluralism. It's the z-axis we talked about with the software loops. It's the invariant vertical pillar that allows the chaotic 2D plane of the pluriverse to exist without collapsing into noise.
Precisely. The equation itself is invariant, but the parameters, specifically Q and S, are hyperlocal, highly contextual, and entirely dependent on the specific world they're measuring.
Okay, so we've mapped static systems, we've mapped frequencies, boundaries, and loops. But reality isn't static. Things move through space and time.
Yeah, motion changes everything.
Animals migrate, people drive cars, hurricanes swirl across oceans. How do we track movement and behavior through these distinct, bounded worlds without forcing them onto a rigid, universal grid?
To understand that, we have to look at the mathematics of trajectories and spatial segmentation. This brings us to a highly complex but incredibly revealing area of computational geometry discussed in our sources.
Let's say you want to track something moving, say an albatross tagged with a GPS tracker. The raw data you get back is a string of time-stamped coordinates, dots on a map.
Right.
You can model this movement in two ways: as a discrete trajectory, which is just plotting the raw dots, or a continuous trajectory, where the algorithm draws a piecewise linear curve connecting the dots.
The sources note a critical trade-off here. While the discrete representation loses absolutely no input data, the continuous representation allows for irregular, complex information to be stored much more concisely.
Because it just connects the dots.
Yes. A long, straight flight path across the ocean can be represented by a single mathematical edge, while a complex, tight foraging pattern over a fishing boat can use a finer, denser resolution.
But the real computational challenge is segmentation. How do you chop up this massive continuous squiggle into meaningful pieces?
That's the hard part.
If you were a biologist tracking that bird, you want to know, when was it sleeping on the water? When was it soaring? When was it actively hunting? You need to find the segments of the line where a certain behavior is mathematically stable.
Traditionally, algorithms rely on what are called monotone criteria. This is a strict mathematical rule.
What's that mean?
It means if a condition is true for a large segment, for example, if the bird's speed stays between 10 and 15 miles per hour for an hour, it must also be strictly true for every single smaller subsegment within that hour.
Which is mathematically very easy for a computer to calculate, but biologically it's ridiculous.
Exactly. Real-world data is inherently noisy. A bird might be generally soaring smoothly, but a sudden thermal gust causes a 1-second spike in speed to 20 miles per hour.
A completely natural anomaly.
Right. But if the algorithm uses strict monotone criteria, That single gust of wind breaks the rule, and the algorithm fragments the trajectory, splitting what should be one long soaring segment into hundreds of useless, tiny fragments.
The universal rule shatters upon contact with localized reality. So researchers had to develop algorithms for non-monotone criteria.
Which is much more forgiving.
This allows for outlier tolerance. It says a segment is valid if the speed is within the range for, say, 95% of the time. Or it relies on the standard deviation of the speed staying below a certain threshold. It allows the boundary of the behavior to be a little fuzzy to absorb some surprisal without breaking the segment.
To solve this computationally, because it's much harder to calculate, researchers utilize a visual tool called a start-stop diagram.
Start-stop diagram.
It's a two-dimensional grid representing all possible segments. The x-axis represents the start time of a segment. The y-axis represents the stop time.
And since you obviously can't stop a segment before you start it, all the valid candidate segments exist in the upper left triangle of this grid.
Correct. And inside that triangle, the algorithm maps out areas of free space, meaning the non-monotone criterion is satisfied. The behavior is stable despite the noise.
And what about the other areas?
Other areas are marked as forbidden space, where the criterion is completely broken. The goal of the segmentation algorithm is to find a continuous staircase path from the bottom left of the grid to the top right, navigating exclusively through the free space using the minimum number of steps.
Each step in the staircase represents an optimal, stable segment of the trajectory.
Exactly. But navigating that grid gets incredibly complicated based on the shape of the forbidden space. The researchers define the cells in this grid using deep topological concepts. Specifically, they identify verticonvex cells and tunnel cells.
The spatial bind calculus here is critical. It heavily reflects RCC8 topological relations.
Let's explain that.
RCC8 stands for Region Connection Calculus, which defines the 8 possible ways two regions can interact in space. They can be disconnected, overlapping, one can be inside the other, they can touch at the boundaries, and so on.
It's all about boundaries.
In the start-stop diagram, the algorithm has to manage how the free space connects and overlaps with the forbidden space. In a verticonvex cell, if you draw a vertical line straight through the cell, it hits the forbidden space in, at most, one continuous block.
Let's find a better analogy for this because it's abstract. Imagine trying to schedule a massive multi-day conference for thousands of people.
Okay.
The free space is the time everyone is available. The forbidden space represents blackout periods times when key speakers are unavailable. A verticonvex cell is like having a single solid block of time in the middle of the day where a keynote speaker is busy.
You just schedule around it.
Right. You schedule the morning, you skip the blackout, and you schedule the afternoon. One obstacle.
That works well, but a tunnel cell is more topologically complex. A vertical line might intersect the forbidden space in 2 distinct blocks.
Exactly. So instead of one blackout period, the speaker is busy from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m., free for 20 minutes, and then busy again from 11:20 to noon.
Oh, that's a nightmare.
To build your schedule, you have to thread a needle through that tiny 20-minute window of free space between 2 massive blackout periods. You have to tunnel through.
Computationally, tunneling is manageable, but the researchers proved a critical limit. If the diagram creates double tunnels, meaning there are 3 or more blocks of forbidden space intersecting a single vertical line, creating multiple narrow windows, you have to jump between simultaneously. The segmentation problem becomes what computer scientists call NP-hard.
NP-hard, meaning it becomes computationally explosive. The algorithm chokes because there are too many overlapping contradictory constraints.
The math breaks down under the weight of the complexity. But when we can solve it by limiting the topology to manageable tunnel cells and using techniques like longest common subsequence, or LCS, for map matching, the results are revolutionary.
LCS map matching is incredible.
It allows researchers to take massive, messy, high-resolution GPS trajectories and match them to road networks without having to load millions of candidate path sets into the computer's memory. The algorithm just finds the longest shared sequence of stable points between the raw GPS data and the map.
Okay, let's pull back and tie this incredibly dense math back to the pluriverse using our pair-consistent lens.
Yeah, let's connect the dots.
Why are we talking about scheduling conflicts, tunnel cells, and NP-hard GPS matching? Because these non-monotone segmentation algorithms are literally doing the computational work of finding the joints in reality.
The joints in reality.
They're mathematically carving out a trajectory where a specific property is stable, acknowledging and absorbing the noise, outliers, and contradictions of the local environment without shattering the whole system.
They are finding the temporal and spatial Markov blankets. They are drawing boundaries around a behavior.
Precisely. And this is the exact architecture we must use to segment and respect different knowledge systems in the pluriverse.
It applies directly.
We cannot take a localized, highly contextual indigenous knowledge system and force it onto a pre-existing candidate path, set a rigid universalist map. We have to use something akin to non-monotone criteria.
We have to accommodate their specific noise and outliers.
We have to find the natural, organic boundaries of their trajectory, recognizing their internal stability and their unique outliers, without breaking their internal logic to fit our grid.
This is the perfect pivot to our final section, operationalizing the pluriverse. We've gone incredibly deep today. We've gone into decolonial philosophy, theoretical neuroscience, fractal biology, and spatial algorithm.
We've covered a lot of ground.
But how do we actually build this? How do we use these computational invariants in the wild to create a more just digital future?
To do that, we need to synthesize the invariants we've discussed. And I want to introduce a few more from the deep sources to show just how universal this pluriversal architecture really is.
Let's do it.
We've seen loop invariants acting as strict mathematical conservation laws in software verification. We've seen Markov blankets and non-equilibrium steady states, drawing boundaries to keep biological and cognitive systems alive.
Right.
We've seen the Q parameter in Zipf-Mandelbrot power laws, organizing the finite limits of linguistics and cities.
The sources also point to some incredible phenomena in physics and biology. They mention critical exponents in thermodynamics, the complex math that governs phase transitions, like exactly when water turns to ice.
That's a huge one.
That same mathematical structure is actually used to optimize neural weight initialization in deep learning AI models. And they mention the codon amino acid mapping in biology.
The codon mapping is a phenomenal example. The universal genetic code uses a specific mapping strategy that resembles hypercube coordinates in advanced coding theory.
Meaning it's structured like a computer.
It structures the translation of DNA so that common transcription errors mutations are mathematically minimized. It is a biological invariant designed to resist noise and preserve the fidelity of the genetic information.
And the sources also list Noetherian symmetries in physics. If you aren't a physicist, Emmy Noether proved that every continuous mathematical symmetry in nature equates to a fundamental conservation law.
The symmetry of time yields the conservation of energy.
And the symmetry of space yields the conservation of momentum.
All of these, from Eiffel Code to genetics to the laws of motion, are computational invariants. They are deep structural mechanisms that constrain dynamical trajectories, compress variation, and stabilize system states against environmental or internal noise. They are the anchors.
They are the z-axis of the pluriverse. And recognizing them allows us to build what the decolonial computing literature calls sovereign AI.
To understand sovereign AI, we have to look at the decolonial critique of current AI development.
Okay, let's get into it.
The literature views the massive, closed AI models developed by megacorporations as modern metropoles. They act as digital colonial powers. They extract massive amounts of localized, contextual data from around the world, strip it of its meaning, process it in a universalist vacuum, and then sell it back to the world as a homogeneous, supposedly objective worldview.
Sovereign AI is the structural antithesis of this extractive model.
Yes.
And just to be clear for the listener, as we discuss sovereign AI, we are objectively reporting the architecture proposed by this movement. We are outlining how these sovereign systems are designed to function based on the engineering specs in our sources.
We are looking at the blueprints.
Sovereign AI completely rejects the idea of infinite continuous scaling and data colonialism. It is about building localized, bounded AI architectures that are explicitly governed by the communities they serve.
The technical blueprint for this involves something called implicit context, auditable coding harness.
That's a mouthful.
It is. These are engineering frameworks that integrate deterministic telemetry directly into the AI's foundational architecture.
Walk me through what an auditable coding harness actually does mechanically.
It means the locus of enunciation is hard-coded into the model's weights. The AI developers using this harness are required by the system syntax to explicitly log their data collection parameters, their specific cultural contexts, their validation methods, and even their funding sources.
So the AI carries its history with it.
All of this acts as metadata attached inextricably to the model. The system becomes inherently self-auditing. It mathematically declares its own boundaries, its own biases, and its own context. It defines its own Markov blanket to the world.
Wait, I see the connection. It's exactly like writing the loop invariant right into the syntax of the Eiffel code we talked about earlier. But instead of a few lines of code, it's for an entire artificial intelligence system.
It's the exact same principle.
It's wild that a loop invariant in a software program, a Markov blanket in a biological cell, and a sovereign AI protecting local community data from extraction, they are all functionally, structurally doing the exact same thing.
They are providing a localized conservation law.
Yes, they allow a specific, bounded system to survive and remain coherent in a chaotic, overlapping universe.
That realization is the operationalization of pluriversal coherence. By recognizing these computational invariants, we finally realize that we do not need to build one massive universal system to achieve global progress.
It's not about making one giant map.
In fact, attempting to build a single universal system is structurally unstable. It will shatter under the noise of reality. Instead, the goal is to build secure, auditable bridges between deeply contextual autonomous worlds.
We are actually seeing this built in the real world. There are localized, low-power AI translation tools being developed entirely within indigenous communities.
Using these precise principles.
These tools utilize the deep mathematical laws of computation, the invariants, the neural networks, but they do so specifically to preserve their unique language and ontology. And they do it without ever exporting their cultural data to a global cloud provider's server. They achieve complete computational sovereignty.
They are mapping their own reality, using their own coordinate system, and establishing their own Q parameter, while still participating safely in the broader pluriverse.
Okay, let's take a deep breath and recap the massive journey we've been on today.
It's been a long trip.
We started by dismantling the universal map, moving from the philosophy of a single reality to the overlapping, paraconsistent worlds of the pluriverse. We dove down into the computer code of loop invariants to find the z-axis of truth that anchors chaos,
We covered the Markov blankets.
and the free energy principle that allow biological minds to survive the surprisal of existence by predicting the world. We navigated the deep tension between continuous fractals and discrete Fibonacci math in the metabolism of finite life.
We found the cultural locus of enunciation, hiding inside the Q parameter of the Zipf-Mandelbrot linguistic equations.
And finally, we tracked spatial segmentation through start-stop diagrams to see how sovereign AI can carve out autonomous, auditable zones of epistemic justice.
It is a profound, unifying synthesis of how structures remain completely stable while simultaneously allowing for infinite localized diversity.
But before we go, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought, a puzzle to mull over long after this audio stops.
What's the puzzle?
We've seen today that computational invariants like the Zipf-Mandelbrot law and the free energy principle dictate the hidden structures of biology, human language, and artificial intelligence. They form the invisible architecture of the pluriverse. But what about us?
Us as individuals.
Yeah. What is the computational invariant of human consciousness itself? Are we just the optimal reachable space navigating a massively complex start-stop diagram of evolutionary history? Or is there a hidden parameter Q sitting at the very center of the human mind, a primal locus of enunciation that mathematics simply hasn't mapped yet?
If the architecture of the pluriverse teaches us anything, it is that there is always another world to map, another context to understand, and another invariant waiting in the noise to be discovered.
The map is never the territory, especially when the territory is a pluriverse. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the universal and keep mapping your own worlds.